ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the 17th and, in fact, the final pre-Ramadan version of Islamicate book reviews. My name is Usaama al-Azami, and this is my weekly session where I interview my colleague Omar Anchassi from the University of Edinburgh on what he's been reading lately. And this week's book, we are actually delighted to read or discuss another colleague's book, a colleague of mine in this case, Christopher Melchert, and his book Before Sufism, Early Islamic Renunciant Piety. And Omar, inshallah, will introduce the book for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll launch into a discussion, followed by an opportunity to engage your comments and questions. As ever, you can write your comments in the on YouTube and Facebook, YouTube on the chat, Facebook in the comments, and we will try to get to them in the last 15 to 20 minutes. And as ever, please remember to subscribe. We will be on hiatus for Ramadan, and indeed the week prior Ramadan. Our own pre-commitments, unfortunately, in the run-up to Ramadan prevent us from actually having a session in the week prior Ramadan as well. And we hope you'll understand that. But we hope to return, inshallah, in the sort of first Thursday after Ramadan. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to you, Omar, and inshallah, introduce the book.
Thank you very much, Usaama. This is an extremely important book, to be sure, and there's rather a lot going on in the book. For a book of this length, it has rather a large number of chapters, 10. So I should probably go through those. But what is the kind of basic thesis of the book? Something that Melchert repeats maybe 4 or 5 times and calls attention to. The title is Before Sufism. So prior to the emergence of Sufism, which he says can be, faithfully termed Islamic mysticism in the mid-9th century or thereabouts, there is an early Islamic renunciant tradition, zuhd, the practitioners of which are referred to usually as zuhad and nusak. And this is the tradition, if you like, out of which Sufism later develops. And what is the key kind of insight Melchert repeats? This early renunciant tradition represents an attempt to preserve the ethos of the conquest period once the conquests have wound down by the early 8th century. So after the death of the Prophet ﷺ, or really starting at the end of his life, Muslims begin a series of conquests that, as Melchert points out, lead to the creation of the largest empire that had been known until that period in human history. And Muslims are, as Patricia Crone has pointed out, a kind of tiny elite, a tiny stratum sitting on top of the rest of society, a conquest elite who are supported not by their labors but through their stipends or atas, this kind of conquest tribute, if you like. So these early Muslims aren't really in need of working for a living, and things slowly change. By the early 8th century, the kind of major part of the conquest is over. People are converting or begin to kind of convert to Islam in considerable numbers. So Muslims kind of slowly increase, or the Muslim community slowly increases in size, having initially been outside of places like Syria, settled in garrison towns of their own founding, such as Kufa, Basra, and Fustat in Old Cairo. And there is this important series of social transformations in the 8th century, in which, or out of which, this early Islamic renunciant tradition emerges. So, along with the kind of end of the conquest period and the increasing professionalization of the military, so it's no longer the case that all Muslim males or many Muslim males of all kinds of backgrounds are going out to fight in the jihad to expand the Dar al-Islam. The military becomes professionalized, and already in the sources in the time of Abd al-Malik bin Marwan, you see this increasing association between active military service and the atas, or this kind of stipend that people are living off. So Muslims basically then, like the rest of us mere mortals, have to earn a living. And this has an implication on the kinds of piety that one is able to cultivate. If you have have to make a living. And there's an important chapter on, if you like, the economics of this renunciant tradition, where he talks about the livelihoods, how did these Zuhaid make a living? Trade was a favored option, although there were many renunciant sayings kind of hostile to or critical of trade as a profession. It's seen as kind of worldly and distracting one from the remembrance of God. As a result of this series of transformations, the renunciant tradition tries to preserve this early ethos. Now, this is a rigorously historical work, and both Usaama and I, we love this kind of textual stuff, and it's overwhelmingly preoccupied with the close reading of primary sources, and many are cited. I think there's more than 20 pages of bibliography, and in exploring the renunciant tradition, these kind of Zuhaid, Melchert has three main sources, he says. To some extent, the works of adab, think of this kind of knowledge that every gentleman should be aware of, Ayun al-Akhbar of Ibn Qutayb and so on, which always contains at least a layer or a certain amount of eloquent locution on the subject of renunciant behavior and so on. And also you have hadith sources, which are kind of distinctive because they devote much attention to isnad and so on. So this would include, for instance, sources like the Kitab al-Zuhd of Ahmed, or also Ibn al-Mubarak's, Abu Naim's Hilyat al-Awliya and so on. Abu Naim's Hilya belongs really to the third genre, which is Sufism. What's very important to point out is that Melchert emphasizes one really has to distinguish the historical development of different styles of Muslim piety. So there is a kind of series of layers or strata, if you like, that historians should tease apart based on a careful reading of the sources, which is really what this book is concerned with, especially in the final chapter when he talks about the transition from renunciant piety to Sufism, kind of especially in the 9th century. And Sufism is really a trend that emerges in Baghdad in the generation before Junaid, who dies in 298. It's especially associated with, or the first kind of Sunni Sufis or reputable Sufis are associated with the circle of Abu Hatim al-Attar, who dies in the 260s, if I'm not mistaken. And in subsequent generations, Sufism absorbs competing mystical and ascetic trends, including the Malamatiyya, for instance, in Khurasan. And it also absorbs kind of practices and institutions, the Salamiyya as well, of whom the most famous adherent probably is Abu Talib al-Makki, the author of Qut al-Qulub, who dies in 386. So classical Sufism is really a synthesis, if you like, of many distinct ingredients. And later Sufi authors, especially in the 11th century, thinking of the authors of these classical handbooks of Sufism like Abu al-Qasim al-Qushayri, they rewrite the history of Sufism so that it incorporates renunciant piety of the 8th century, as well as competing trends such as the Malamatiyya, the Salamis to some extent, also figures like Sahl al-Tustari, and so on. And classical Sufism is this kind of interesting mix of elements. And I should briefly, Usaama, before we discuss it, and I know you have many interesting points to make, give you a sense of the structure of the book. Unfortunately, I will have to depart from my usual practice because there are many chapters to this book, so I'll have to actually read out the chapters. First chapter, basic problems. Chapters 2 to 5 on physical and moral austerities, supererogatory forms of worship, and new devotional forms are largely a kind of anthology, if you like, many primary sources in translation, which I think is extremely valuable. And we could very comfortably assign these chapters to undergraduate students who want to know more about early Islamic renunciant piety. And he intersperses each of these, you have a few stories, anecdotes, or Zuhdi sayings, interspersed with analytical comments. So for instance, when it comes to moral austerity, you could say, all of these reports about early Zuhaid not laughing for 40 years or not smiling for 30 years, or al-Awza'i is reported to have said, I think it's improper even to smile. Melchert will then interject and say, well, you do find contrary reports and even hadith that suggest a certain discomfort with this. I mean, his kind of approach to hadith texts is very Shachtian. And generally speaking, one can say that, like Shacht, he recognizes that reports attributed to the Tabi'in, the generation of the especially early 2nd century, are much more likely to be historical than material attributed to the companions and the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And so, he will say, well, you have these reports where the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam laughed until his molars were visible, and some renunciants and later Sufis, uncomfortable with the idea of the Prophet laughing with his mouth open wide, will gloss it by saying, for instance, that, well, he was smiling and somehow he showed his molars when smiling, which of course is absurd. Anyway, chapter 6 is very interesting because it engages quite heavily with Peter Brown's idea of the holy man. So chapter 6 is on the holy man, Muslim holy man specifically, not the holy man late antiquity in Brown's sense. And then chapter 7 on renunciance in politics, very interesting, and abstaining from the rulers or not perhaps in some circumstances. 8, as I said, on the economics of renunciation, how did they earn a living and so on, and institutional forms that later emerged in Sufism, and how this helped sustain a class of religious, something we can perhaps discuss and revisit later in the show. And he also talks about opposition to renunciation, which is very interesting. We do have to come to that before finally embarking on, in chapter 10, on the transition to Sufism. So I hope that's given you, there's a lot going on in this book. There are so many chapters and so many sources and moving parts, as it were, to the argument. But I hope that's given us a sufficient basis for further discussion, Usaama.
Yes, absolutely. Jazakumullah khairan. And I just wanted to sort of highlight the footnotes in the version of the book I was using. I was actually using an EPUB version, are continuous. And so by the time we're in chapter 10, it's saying, footnote 1080 or something like that. So it's very copiously sort of sourced text. And
so I would say on average, every page, I would guess you'll have 5 or 6, at least 5 or 6 references to primary sources, something like that.
So, it's really gone into those primary sources in a way, exploring the Hilya and various other, the Zuhd works in the early period.
Yes, I should also say he draws also on Shi'i sources, Ismaili sources to a lesser extent. Mm-hmm. In terms of the Sunni Shi'i distinction, I should mention, Melchert says there are 3 things he will not really be, or will omit in his account of early Islamic Renunciant Piety. So he does not really focus on the gender question, although there's been a lot of recent scholarship on this. Right. He says, or he suggests that initial kind of research indicates that for the most part, most of the time, female renunciant piety was not gendered. Yes, you do find gendered expressions of it, but most of the time this is not the case. Secondly, the main issue with researching Shi'i renunciant piety is the problem with the sources, which tend to be later than Sunni sources, so 9th and 10th century, as opposed to 8th. And it seems, if you look in Al-Barqi's Mahasin or Kulaini or Kulini's Kafi, these are simply kind of Sunni reports in a kind of Shi'i garb. And finally, he doesn't really look at apocalypticism in piety. Right, but there is...
but he has written, if I recall correctly, a fairly comprehensive article on apocalypticism specifically.
Indeed, and one of the nice things about this book is, of course, it builds on many years of important contributions to both the study of early Islamic Renunciant piety and to some extent Sufism as well. Right. The piety of the Hadith folk, especially this article I've been very influenced by on the transition from asceticism to mysticism. Now, I should say in terms of terminology, in this book, I think it's fair to say to a much greater extent than his previous work, Melchert adopts the terminology of Zuhd and renunciant piety as opposed to this term of ascetic coming from the Greek which literally means athlete. So think of a sort of spiritual athletics.
Right.
So he only really, or most of the time in this book, he only discusses asceticism when contrasting it with mysticism. So the distinction between asceticism and mysticism is really about this distinction, or is coterminous with this distinction between early Zuhd and renunciant piety versus what emerges, especially in the mid-9th century onwards, Sufism, as we would know it.
Right.
And there is a nice diagram illustrating this distinction, but the main thing is really this emphasis in renunciant piety on a kind of fear of a transcendent God versus in mysticism, which one finds in many religious traditions, of course, a kind of emphasis on experiential knowledge of God and also a kind of communion with an immanent deity. So interesting kind of contrast.
He also, so I remember looking at that sort of table and thinking, so he places optimism under sort of mysticism and kind of a pessimism, or as you put it, fear of God, under Zuhd and or asceticism. Actually, he doesn't. Zuhd is renunciant piety, I suppose. But it did make me wonder. Obviously these are very broad typologies. I don't think he was trying to read too much into it, because you do have within Sufism, in the mature guys, I've heard a Shadili Sheikh, for example, comment that Ghazali's outlook is more about inspiring fear of God, whereas Abu Hassan al-Shadili's outlook is more about Ghazali is more khawf and Abu Hassan al-Shadili is more about raja, for example.
Yes, and I think Melchert clearly acknowledges one finds different emphases, not only within Sufism. He accounts for all of these tensions in early Islamic Renunciant Piety, but even within different religions you can speak of greater and lesser emphases and different trends. And you could even contrast, he suggests, religions to others in terms of more ascetic or more mystical. He does seem to like very much Ahmed Kara Mustafa's book on the formative period of Sufism. Now, that framework of asceticism versus mysticism is very much indebted to Max Weber. And Max Weber spoke of ideal types. So again, it's, you have to kind of make these generalizations in order to analyze anything.
He does appeal to Weber when in that later chapter when he's talking about asceticism, and I missed this perhaps, but in that particular chapter, I assume he's kind of returning to that because he kind of dissociates from the term asceticism when discussing Zuhd in the beginning of the book, and he says, as you say, asceticism is more related to mujtahid, for example, in the Sufi terminology, whereas Zahid would be more renunciant. But when he's talking about the Weberian typology, is he basically just using that as, this is more Zuhd versus Tasawwuf? Is that
yes, that's my understanding.
Right.
And he accepts, without problematizing it too much, that, Sufism is Islamic mysticism, and mysticism is about experiential knowledge and communion with God, even though in something that Kara Mustafa discusses in his book, scholars of religious studies endlessly, interminably debating categories like religion and mysticism and their definition, and are they Eurocentric and all of this business, which I think he wisely steers clear of. They're not always very profitable discussions. Well, according to me, anyway.
I felt the gap. As you know, I'm a little more preoccupied with some of these discussions, and I thought that it would be because he makes a comment. He talks about sort of the way in which modern traditionalists, for example, in Mark Sedgwick's sort of terminology, are people who look at the what's the phrase they use? The universality of all religious traditions.
Yes, so the idea that mysticism is really at the heart of all religions and all of this, which he says is problematic because it contrasts what nearly all mystics say about their own religious traditions.
And I entirely agree with that critique. But at the same time, I felt that at times, these are interminable debates, as you mentioned, and I'm reminded of sort of Alistair McIntyre's comments about modern ethical discourse as being interminable. But I thought that that will leave some readers a little dissatisfied potentially when they're thinking about the question of, okay, well, how do these sort of like human propensities manifest in the modern period, so to speak, where presumably if these tendencies have existed among human beings for thousands of years, maybe they're, to use a Freudian term, sublimated in some way in the modern context. But as you say, it's not really the point of his book. So
yes, yeah. But I mean, again, mysticism emerges later. This is a very clear theme of the book.
Yeah.
And thinking of the holy man, I mean, Peter Brown is very much in the background and is cited a number of times.
Yeah.
And he does ask this question that scholars of Sufism are always exploring. Well, where does it come from? So, for Melchert, it's not like there's a pristine Islam free of influence, because he notes that the Quran is obviously biblical narratives figuring in very prominently. And he speculates, though he doesn't dwell on the point, because he says he doesn't have the requisite languages, Syriac and Greek, to kind of demonstrate it. But he says there are clear parallels and continuities between Syriac monastic piety and early renunciant piety. So you even find occasionally parallel sayings, and certainly many of the sentiments are shared. But
yeah, I mean, sorry, go ahead.
Yes, but he says that kind of scholarship, and I know figures like Rayhan Dormaz of Brown University is really working on this kind of overlap. He said it's a theme that hopefully scholarship can increasingly explore. Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and some of our colleagues actually at Oxford and some of their students, so I'm thinking, Nikolai Sana is cited by Melchert in that connection, so to speak, as being one of these people who tries to explore that sort of contextual history. And my own sort of good friend, Saqib Hussain, who's a student of Nikolai, is also exploring some of these questions. I look forward to his dissertation when it gets published, and he's actually publishing, I think, a couple of important articles about the sort of historical context of, I forget which surah, but it's going to be an expansive read, I understand. So we look forward to those things as well. I mean, I just very briefly, the notion of a pristine sort of Islam, it's something which I wonder. I sometimes wonder who he's arguing against in those sorts of instances, because I wonder if he makes a very sharp distinction between the historian or the scholarly historian and the sort of the confessional believer, so to speak, which I think there are, of course, various different perspectives on these sorts of questions, but my colleague Christopher takes a somewhat sort of old school view on this, shall we say. I just sort of wonder if there are outside of the sort of lay believer kind of within the Islamic scholarly class who have been the people to preserve the multiplicity of doctrines in the earliest period, whether it's in the Musannaf works and so on, and the various qira'at. Does anyone really think that these things are pristinely preserved, or is there? I feel there's a recognition in the tradition within the tradition.
To some extent, yes. I mean, and this is something that's come up in our discussions before. Someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, when contrasted with other figures in the Muslim tradition, is certainly much more historically minded. So he does actually say interesting things about the development.
But not earlier than that, you think?
No, I mean, there is surely awareness that there was development, but Sufism, goes out of its way to stress continuities with the Renunciant tradition.
That's absolutely
so. It's in the
true,
interests of the classical Sufi handbooks, for instance, by Qushayri, to kind of rewrite this history
to
as one
all
seamless
of these,
whole.
Acquiring all these authorities who have been accepted by,
And just thinking of going back to this theme of the holy man in late antiquity and how early Islamic renunciant piety continues and in some sense also diverges from it. And he points out that Muslims didn't appropriate everything; they kept what made sense to them. And there are some distinctions. So the holy man in late antique Christianity is first and foremost a kind of arbiter and intercessor, and the kind of form that arbitration takes in the Islamic context, really for Melchert, is iftar. Iftar in one report he finds is a kind of putting oneself between the believer and God. Why? Because you're sort of speaking on God's behalf,
yes.
as Ibn al-Qayyim kind of
Yes.
famously says.
إعلام الموقعين, yeah.
Exactly.
Yes.
Now, in the early period, before, after the conquest have wound down, you find increasing professionalization of the military, as I said, but also differentiation, socially speaking and sociologically speaking.
Right.
So you have the emergence, instead of learned, holy people, as it were, jurists and renunciants, and the kind of paths to some extent begin to diverge by the end of the 8th century. And this is why he has this kind of interesting, chapter on opposition to renunciant piety. So
Right.
some strands of the Kitab al-Kasb attributed to Shaybani, which came up in the episode on Sean Anthony's book, seem to be genuinely Shaybani's. I know Melchert has an article on this. Of course, much of it dates later, but in Shaybani, but certainly in Muhasibi, who has a chapter on makasib, he is kind of critical of this already by, probably as early as Shaqiq al-Balkhi, who dies in 194. And it's also sometimes attributed to Sahl al-Tustari. This view that it is unlawful to earn one's living, or in the case of Balkhi, he says that haraka, even movement to earn one's livelihood is unlawful. So when this kind of professionalization and I should say differentiation increases, you find increasing tension between the traditionalists and some forms of renunciant piety. Although when you have your first kind of proper Sufi circles emerging with Abu Hatim al-Attar, who dies in the 260s, Melchert notes that he did not attract traditionalist criticism. In fact, eschewed the Ahl al-Mahabba, these kind of Sufis who stressed the rhetoric of ishq, of passionate love for God. And he does at the end talk about the Inquisition against the Sufis launched by Ghulam Khalil in 264. Right. But you do find these divergences. I mean, even in terms of the kinds of miracles and karamat cultivated and practiced by the early renunciants. Less stress among the Muslims than in the Christians on healing and resolving famine and so on. But intercessory prayer is very important. His dua was answered, as it were. And there's a very interesting discussion of the Abdal, these kind of curious figures. And on this theme of pristine, pure Islam, he points out that while he speculates on the origins, and he says that, in the Talmud there's reference to 36 kind of holy figures, the number of the Abdal being 40, you find references to the Budala and kind of parallel ideas. The idea being that a spiritual replete whose number is constantly replenished when one passes away, already in Musnad Ahmed. Of course, much later in Sufism, classical Sufism, it becomes an elaborate hierarchy with the Qutub and all of these other Awtad and so on. But you find,
I mean, just looking at the Musnad of Ahmed, and also I think this comes in works of the students of Ahmed as well. I forget which book he's citing in particular. But, Ahmed didn't have a problem with this notion of Abdal, and then, he also talks about the fact that some of the Abdal, it's reported that they didn't, really know that they were Abdal, so to speak. It's something that was, in a sense, revealed after they died or something along those lines. And
so by the way, we should stress, notice this contrast between this renunciant tradition where Abdal may not even know they're Abdal, and they certainly wouldn't proclaim it. When you go to the more extravagant forms of later Sufism, where as Fazl Rahman, says they tend to make these extravagant claims about themselves being the Mujaddid and the, seal of the Muhammadan saints and the Qutub and all of this business. So this is just one respect in which you find a very clear distinction between the early Islamic renunciant tradition and classical or Sufism, essentially.
And, I mean, one thing that came to mind as I was reading that section on the Abdal was that, as far as I recall, the Muhaddithin are very scathing about the reports that are attributed to the Prophet about this. But you do find them in the Musnad of Imam Ahmad, and I think they are sort of not considered to be the strongest by modern editors or by someone like Ibn Taymiyyah, who discusses them much earlier. By Ibn
Yes.
Taymiyyah's time, you're seeing that sort of what you described as kind of like these extravagant claims. My recollection and my history of Tasawwuf is not great, but my recollection is that it's not really terribly pronounced at the time of Ghazali. It's not in the sort of his major works, and
certainly
but,
it becomes more pronounced over time, that's for sure.
and so in a sense what you've got is this development which is happening within the Ahl al-Hadith in a sense at the time of Ahmad, of notions of Abdal and things like this. that
And Melchert,
comes-
of course,
yeah.
is not,
looking at the
he
late
is,
period.
he is interested in asanid, but
Right.
not in the way a classical Muslim hadith critic might be. So, pardon me,
Right.
Rashid Rida does have an interesting article on this where he basically says, it doesn't appear till very late, relatively speaking, and in the Musnad, these are all very dubious, and he, as far as I remember, he cites Ibn Taymiyyah when discussing this.
But
certainly the
fact
Qutb
that-
seems to be a later development. The Abdal
Sure,
came
but-
first.
But the fact that Ahmad is giving it credence, he includes it in his collection, and he
But,
also his
that-
students seem to quote from him that such is but
Yeah, but something appearing in the Musnad does not mean it has a basis. There are plenty, by classical hadith standards, there are a number of fabrications outright fabrications in the Musnad.
but I'm trying to signal that even for someone
the
a
idea has
staunch
appeared.
Ahl al-Hadith figure as a staunch sort of like symbol in our minds at least, in the later sort of like, you could say, mythology, without being disparaging, so to speak, of what Ahl Sunnah is. Ahmad is that central figure in a sense that
Yeah.
stands up for Sunnah against Bid'ah and things like this, and the Mihna and so on. So
Yes.
I find that. In a sense, there's something to be said about what's the allergy that Rida feels. To a certain extent, that is the development of these concepts in later Sufism, right? When
Yes,
Sufism
but-
comes to its own.
I agree. I should say that, and this doesn't feature in the book so much, but when he talks about Sufism rewriting its history, and he does talk about how this kind of new Sufi ethos becomes all pervading and
Right.
so on.
Right.
So successful is this rewriting
Yeah.
that people like Junaid, even to a scholar like Ibn Taymiyyah, is just part of the mainstream of Sunni Islam,
Right.
even though many of these figures were somewhat controversial. He says that
Yeah, that was an interesting discussion
some
of Junaid's
extent-
sort of
yes,
prevarication, so to speak.
yes, and his studied ambiguity, shall we say.
Yes.
And he escaped persecution. It seems to be historical. I think Melchert suggests when people were being rounded up, when
Right.
Ghulam Khalil started his inquisition
Right.
by claiming he was a jurist of the school of Abu Thawr, and therefore not a Sufi and beyond suspicion, as it were.
Right.
And classical Sunnism, part of that synthesis is, of course, is Sufism, not merely
Yeah.
early renunciant
Yeah, yeah.
piety.
Yeah. Although, again, this is where thinking about, the Taymiyyah tradition and Omar Anchassi, of course, and Aryan Post are, I think, the two major figures in the current sort of scholarship on that Taymiyyah tradition. Omar speaks about, Sufism without mysticism, right? And, that's an interesting, that in many respects, that's an important trend in the modern period as well, because of this sort of rejection of extravagant claims and all the rest of it.
You could read that as an attempt to reclaim this early Islamic, or
Right.
appropriate this early Islamic Renunciant piety. Now,
Right.
the thing is, there are elements. Melchert says at the outset he's not trying to sell the renunciant tradition to anyone, but it is a tradition with integrity and deserves our respect. But if you read chapters 2 to 5,
Right.
which feature so many primary sources,
Yes.
you do come
Extremely
to the
rich, yeah.
conclusion that your own worship is worthless, basically. But there are strands that seem somewhat extreme. So people not eating, or eating once a month,
Or fasting until
fasting
then,
perpetually,
sort of
siyam
turning
ad-dahr.
green, so to speak.
Yes,
and
things like
dying,
this. Discussion of, he always mentions the tensions and contradictory reports and so on.
Right.
So the idea, for instance, that you should not read the Quran in fewer than 3 days.
Right.
But the Kufans seem to have been fine with less than this, it seems.
I mean, he said the traditionists generally seem to be sort of, or traditionalists, as you, so the al-Hadith, I assume he means in that particular instance, seem to be fine with it, which just struck me as like, they're the last people you expect to do that, because these are reports which are transmitted from the Prophet, right?
Yes,
but it's ubiquitous, yeah.
Yeah, and already within Islamic Renunciant Piety, you also have a tendency of critique, or there's always the possibility of critique.
Right.
Melchert says that unlike modern athletics, these zuhad cannot exceed the example of the Prophet.
Right.
So he says already with Malik in the Muwatta, you find these reports, about a man who would stand in the sun and not speak and fast continuously. Right. And the Prophet ﷺ is reported to have reproached him and said, he should speak, he should stand in the shade, and he can continue his fast. Right. And he mentions, I think, the Haq bin Muzahim saying that he didn't like musk. And when being told that the companions wore it and used it, reportedly he said, we know better than them, or something like this. So this possibility of critique is always, you can always mobilize it by saying, so Melchert says that, and again, by the end of the 8th century, there does seem to be a kind of increasing distance between, or as a result of this differentiation between traditionalists, the al-Hadith, and the renunciants. And part of it is really to do with this kind of critique. Right. So he says that the austerities commanded in the Hadith corpus, as represented by the 6 books, for instance, are relatively moderate. Right. You have none of this business of eating once a month or twice a month, or not eating meat. And you do find the vegetarian strand, even although it's not very prominent.
He quotes
the
from
Prophet,
so
the Prophet, as is well known, married and ate meat, and the companions ate clarified butter or salmon. So all of these other things, they were kind of warriors, and their piety, of course, did entail certain kinds of renunciation. And the Quran talks about those who أدنى من ثلثي الليل ونصفه وطائفة من الذين آمنوا معك. So it does talk about people staying up, half the night, and so that is, if you like, indigenous or it's this kind of.
It's Quranic at the very least, and so it's very central in the canon.
So insofar as one can speak of a pristine Islam, certainly the Quran is it. Right. At least.
Yeah, I mean, again, like just on the sort of a bit of a bugbear about the labeling of pristine in that way. I mean, I think there is this consciousness among the earliest people that, they're literally sitting down and deriving ahkam, right? A lot of them, at least, I guess, you have the difference of approach among the Ahl al-Ra'i and Ahl al-Hadith, so to speak, and or the Ara'itiyin and the people like Malik. But they are very self-consciously recognizing that we are dealing with, masail that were being asked, and they're having to engage in ijtihad. In a sense, what's interesting is for them, it's the ijtihad episteme, so to speak, to use again the language of Ahmed Fakri Ibrahim. The codification episteme comes later on, and I guess it's for later scholars, and it's in the modern period that we think very self-consciously about development, historical development. It's not necessarily the case that they were thinking, okay, well, we're obviously a part of the history, and this is how that's doing. For them, it's like, well, anything that happened before us at the time of the Prophet was a perfect age that we need to emulate whatever we can, and everything else is declined. A lot of people are thinking in those terms, of course. So there is a kind of development. It's just a negative development.
And something Melchert points to, and he stresses continuity in the sense that, especially in the Zuhd literature, one finds all kinds of reports, for instance, in Ahmed's Kitab al-Zuhd about pre-Muhammadan Prophet ﷺ.
Right.
And, monks often feature in these kinds of reports. Again, to return to this distinction, to a much greater extent than is true of Christian asceticism, because already with the solidarity of this early conquest elite, who, as Kroner says, number no more than 500,000, reigning over or ruling over a population of anywhere between 20 and 30 million. So you're talking about a thin crust on top of society.
Right.
But there is a very strongly communal element from the outset by virtue of things like jihad and so on. And the fact that Muslims are living in Amsar and in
garrison cities. Yeah. Which help maintain their language and culture.
So, he says you don't really find many Muslims there are no Muslim desert fathers. If you go to a desert, you'll find monks much more than you'll find Muslim ascetics, and the cell of the Muslim is his house or her house, rather than these kind of separate communities. Now, with the kind of development of waqf law, and he says habus is the term kind of used more in the early period, you get this possibility for a kind of institutionalized religious class who kind of then do their separate thing. So that's kind of classical Sufism. You have these ribats and so on.
Right. So in a sense, the waqf allows for, it's a fascinating sort of drawing on the history and to recognize that there are certain transformations taking place in society that allow for the manifestation of certain kinds of religious culture to appear.
Absolutely. So it is kind of concerned with this sociological development and differentiation. So he talks about religions having, two possible solutions to this. So, once you have this post-conquest period and so on, well, either you can put renunciant behavior kind of within the reach of people generally,
right,
which he terms the Protestant solution,
right,
or you can create a separate class of religious who
elites,
this is the monastic solution,
right.
And he says you find kind of elements of the monastic solution in classical Sufism, but in the renunciant tradition, there's an expectation that no, these are ideals that everyone should try to implement.
Right.
The Sufis are kind of more aware of this differentiation, and they do see themselves as in some sense, a spiritual elite,
right,
who hold themselves to a higher standard.
And this is in classical Sufism. You're saying that in a sense, society, and you're drawing on Melchert, obviously, is developed enough and in a sense structurally differentiated enough to start to manifest these various sort of social categories.
Precisely.
And he speaks also about the ribat transforming it to a sort of khanqa in a sense. In the classical period, The
khanqa, by the way, an institution that classical Sufism seems to have adopted from the Karamiya. He says, by the way, the correct term is Karamiya, not Karamiya, with the shadda on the ra, based on some poetry.
Pardon my ignorance. Please remind me, the Karamiya are a sort of
this kind of competing ascetical movement. Ibn Karam dies in 255, I want to say. Okay. Very much associated with early Hanafism and kind of wonder-working and feats of, miraculous feats and so on, preaching.
So liturgical,
theologically, they're mostly remembered for their supposed anthropomorphist tendencies.
Right.
And Aaron Zaisau has done some work on the Margaret Malamed and others as well.
Right.
But yes,
and so I think has written the Encyclopedia of Islam article on them, or something along.
Yes, and this interesting article that Melchert cites, I think it's the very last reference in the bibliography, by virtue of Zaisau's name beginning Z-Y.
Right.
These kind of two early Karami texts, one of which is Al-Sughdi's Fatawa, which preserves actual fiqhi opinions, it seems, of Ibn Karam himself, which is very fascinating.
So, in a sense, forgive me, in a sense, the suggestion is that the khanqa, or the zawiya, so to speak, to use the Arabic term, is something which develops internally to the Islamic scholarly tradition rather than being adopted from other traditions.
Well, that's unclear. It's not something Melchert comments on, and I know that other scholars have pointed to the influence of Buddhism, and he says, you do find Muslims who... So it's not the case that all Muslims, Melchert says, accept Sufism as a kind of trans-historical essence, or I think he says super-historical essence that has always pervaded Islam. But
Yeah.
Some Muslim critics of Sufism, he says, do stress this external influence model.
Right.
Influence is something of a dirty word. He says he prefers the term variant development because there is no kind of pristine Islam, as it were.
Right.
But he says, well, if that was true, then why is it that Sufism emerges in Iraq and Egypt rather than further east in Iran?
Right.
And why does it emerge when Buddhist influence has really kind of diminished in the 9th century rather than early on when it was much stronger, at least potentially?
Yeah, I mean, fascinatingly, I mean, I recall, I think fairly early, Hallaj is accused of, spending time in India and drawing on traditions from there. But
so Dhahabi's account in the Siyar is basically that he was this wonder worker who was a charlatan and a sorcerer who learned from India and so on.
Right. But at the same time, just a contemporary sort of scholar who some people might be a bit surprised, someone like Muhammad al-Hasan al-Dada, who is seen as kind of a Salafi/Islamist oriented figure. I remember listening to a lecture of his on tasawwuf, and he was saying that, well, spiritual traditions can be drawn on from other sort of even non-Muslim sources if necessary, like certain practices. And yeah. So
I've
I mean,
got
if certain...
in some very heated conversations. Yeah. Actually, one with a former student of Dr. Melchert, when I referred to certain Sufi breathing practices as Hindu-inspired rituals. But
I mean, the Lata'if sit in the Naqshbandi tradition and the sort of the 6 chakras, or sorry, I don't know my Sufism or my Buddhism well enough, but the chakra points in the Indian / broader tradition. There are too many of these commonalities to be just dismissive of outside influence. But what's interesting for me is someone like Muhammad al-Hasan al-Dada suggesting that, well, that's perfectly fine if it's useful for the sort of spiritual practice in question. He suggests that. And, yeah.
I'm not really happy with that. But anyway.
It's a more emic conversation.
Yeah, and you do find these divergences, from the model of the Christian holy man in late antiquity.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, it's interesting, one thing he comments that, the very first figure it seems to be called the Sufi, who is not a Sufi in the later sense,
right,
is this Abu Hasim of Kufa, who dies in 150. And in the second half of the 2nd century, you do find figures such as associated with the Sufiyat al-Mu'tazila. He says that Mu'tazila is emerging from some kind of renunciant movement, because i'tizal means kind of to seclude oneself or remove oneself from the company of. And those rebuking rulers, for instance, so they're very strongly associated again with this, in the earliest period, al-Nahy an al-Munkar. So he talks about this story of someone criticizing al-Ma'mun and so on.
Right.
But Sufism itself unfolds, and the signification of that term, in fact, shifts considerably in the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
I mean, towards the conclusion of the book, Christopher talks about the fact that, Sufism has this ability to read anything as a Sufi text, right? This is, I can't remember exactly. I think it was Ibn Ajiba or something like this, or one of these sort of more westerly figures who wrote a commentary on the Ajurumiyya, which was a Sufi commentary, right?
Yes.
And you can
even
find these
Jami, by the way, there are Sufi elements in his commentary on the Kafiya or whatever advanced grammatical text is, or the Shafiya, one of these, I forget.
Right.
And Melchert says, I mean, this is part of the nature of mysticism, if one can speak of the nature of mysticism, because as he once said to a student, mystics can find inspiration or the presence of God in a phone book.
Yeah, that's a fascinating
very
line.
Entertaining line.
But I mean, it's a great line in so many respects. I think
there are quite a few entertaining one-liners, by the way, in the book. There's a sort of dry sense of humor I find amusing.
Right. I mean, when I've taught in a classroom setting, undergraduates about the sort of, this is one of the things that I actually personally enjoy in the sort of company of writers in the realm of tasawwuf, I very often use William Chittick's Sufism: A Beginner's Guide, and it's it's so full of poetry as a text as well, but it's about how one develops a lens with which to see the world as a source of inspiration.
Yeah.
And I mean, I particularly William Chittick's book is very different from Christopher's book in the sense that
the contrast between the heaven and the earth, and I'll let the listener figure out or decide which is the heaven and which is the earth.
but yes, I mean, it's that's one dimension of that tradition that I particularly enjoy, as it were. Yeah.
Yes, but I mean, I really like.
But at the same time, Chittick,
I think, value in this approach. Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, the challenge that we face when reading someone like Chittick is because when now I've got sort of Christopher's book, so if I'm in the position of teaching Sufism again, I've got another resource to draw on. But the contrast between someone like Chittick and Kara Mustafa's sort of formation of Sufism is striking, because one is a historical work and the other is a work of inspiration, as it were.
Oh, you mean Chittick rather than Kara Mustafa?
Yes, so Chittick is a work of inspiration in a sense. He's trying to get people interested and trying to, in a sense, help people experience it to a certain extent. Which,
yes,
as you mentioned,
I'm sure Melchert would be uneasy with. I mean, I think in fields
in as
like
much as
Sufism,
in as much as taking it too seriously, I think Christopher would not necessarily encourage. But you saw he's telling a student, okay, why don't you try this renunciant practice of not talking
or
about
not being involved with what does
ما لا
not
يعنيك,
concern one. Yeah,
so to speak.
precisely.
And he found it very difficult because he had to end up engaging in small chit chat with a guest who dropped in, a guest of his wife or something like that.
Yes, they were curious about old friends and what they'd got up to and stuff.
Right. And so that's a fascinating experiment to engage in, I think, with Christopher is very conscious about. He mentions it, I think, in that context or elsewhere, that these things really one struggles with, and in some cases, some of these people must have been quite unpleasant as well, right? People engaged in some of these sorts of ascetic practices.
He talks about, so you have this argument about makasib and kasb prohibiting earning means of living, but much more commonly in the renunciant tradition, something Muhasibi also criticizes, neglect of one's wife and children and so on.
Right.
Which is, I mean, you could say, well, even the Quran says, إِنَّمَا أَمْوَالُكُمْ وَأَوْلَادُكُمْ فِتْنَةً, and all of this other business. So you could say it has Quranic roots, but,
but it's
one can pursue it to extremes, for sure.
Yeah, I mean, of course, a sort of mature Sunni synthesis would, reject those sorts of claims on the basis of the way in which the Prophet lived his life and tried to sort of.
Well, I mean, mature classical Sunnism is really a big tent, so it's not that you can't find these elements present there as well.
That's very true.
They coexist with contradictory trends.
Yeah.
So, you have hadith discouraging and even prohibiting begging.
Right.
And saying that it's better to, get a firewood on your back and to sell it than to beg for one's living. But, you had, on the other hand, renunciants who, lived essentially off the charity of others.
Right.
And renunciants who also condemn living or being dependent on others. This kind of, what one finds in this literature.
And even within the mature tradition.
On independence from other humans, yes.
And as you mentioned, even in the mature tradition, which is a big tent tradition, you have these tendencies among the Malamitiya and various other sort of groups, and even within sort of orthodox, quote unquote, sort of orthodox readings of people like Ghazali, you can find treatments of these questions as very often, I think, short-term practices that you engage in order to gain a certain kind of, for example, self-abnegation, to recognize that, look, you're not beneath begging, so to speak.
Yes, things like, I can't remember if it's the Ghazali or one of the Malamatis who discusses stealing clothes from a bathhouse so that people call you a thief and condemn you and your ego is destroyed and all of this.
Yeah.
So Ghazali,
Ghazali probably wouldn't encourage that, but he'd narrate the story. That's my take. Right?
Now, right at the end of the book, he does mention Ghazali's Ihya. Ghazali's Ihya is really the big synthesis.
Right.
All of these competing trends, well, not all of them. I mean, classical Sufism does marginalize. In fact, many of the earliest figures to be labeled Sufis And it's especially, you find already in like Kalabadi and these other chaps, this kind of antinomian trend are rejected, and law continues to remain important to the classical Sufi tradition.
Right.
But Ghazali is, one of these rewriters, and the Ihya is a synthesis, and he borrows heavily without acknowledgement from the Qut al-Qulub, of course.
Right. I'm a little conscious of time. We have about 5 more minutes, and if anyone has any questions, please do feel free. This has been a wonderful conversation, Omar, and of course we need to be very grateful to Christopher Melchert for writing really a fascinating book. Notwithstanding
Indeed.
my own sort of predilection for the inspirational, so to speak, but as you mentioned, Omar, chapters 2 to 5 can be read in that sort of spirit.
Yes, so
as a devotional,
not inappropriately,
as we in the run up to Ramadan.
Precisely. Yeah, I mean, if you were to just take chapters 2 to 5,
right,
which Melchert intersperses here and there with analysis and explaining these contradictory trends and reports.
Right.
You could, great, especially because there are so many primary sources in translation, excellent for assigning to undergrads.
Right.
But you could assign, it's a spiritually edifying the section of the workbook. I mean, honestly, when you're reading it, you can't help but be affected by, all of these reports on fasting and prayer and so on.
And this is, in a sense, the raison d'etre of these writings. Ironically, it's coming through in a sort of work of very serious history.
Yes.
But as you say, you can read this, and I'm reminded of reading something like, I don't know, Madarij Salikin or something like this, that you get report after report, and it's kind of, to a certain extent, if you're reading this in that sort of spirit, it's like it's bashing you around the head, saying, what are you doing with your life?
I mean, I felt very ashamed, actually, when reading chapters 2 to 5, which I'm sure Dr. Melchert will find amusing.
I'm sure you'll find very amusing, yes, indeed. But in any case, as I say, I think we're very grateful for this work, and there are so many other dimensions, as you say. It's actually, they're short chapters, but they're so packed with substance in my reading.
I mean, I don't know if it's my imagination, but I felt the font was maybe slightly smaller, the lines were closer together also, because you feel on every page there is a huge amount of material.
Yeah,
maybe it's just the frequent citations from primary and secondary sources or something.
No, I don't think it's your imagination, because if I recall correctly, so some publishers, and De Groote is similar to Brill in this, as far as I recall, they have a slightly, قطعة كبيرة, so to speak. They have a slightly longer spine length, and so the writing ends up appearing a bit smaller if you're sort of, reading it on screen as I did. And yeah, I mean, in terms of the actual sort of, it took me, it felt like, particularly some of these chapters with the copious footnotes drawing extensively on, book Kutub of Zuhd, and Halyat al-Awliya is very, very copiously drawn on.
Probably, I would guess, the single most cited source in the book, primary source.
In fact, I mean, I'd venture to suggest, and you'd be better on this than I am, but it's probably one of the few texts in the English language that draws so heavily on Hilya. So it may be actually one of the better expositions of the contents of the Hilya on these certain questions.
Honestly.
So yeah, I mean, the Hilya, I feel, has been one of these neglected later sort of collections.
Yes, and he does defend it in the sense that it's one of these works that has attracted a lot of criticism, and he kind of discusses Jonathan Brown's critique that,
I didn't feel, I mean, this is where I maybe dissent a little from Christopher's reading, but I didn't think that Jonathan Brown's sort of paragraph was necessarily critical. He wasn't saying that this isn't to be,
I think it was critical, but Melchert says that, well, I think, the sense I got from Brown's paragraph was perhaps different from Dr. Melchert's, because Dr. Melchert says, well, if you look at earlier sources, earlier than the Hilya, these prove that Abu Nu'aym is reporting his material carefully without distorting it. But Brown is not accusing Abu Nu'aym of making anything up. He's accusing him of just reporting all of this, dodgy material, basically.
Well, yes, but I mean, the thing is, again, in the defense of both Brown and Melchert to a certain extent, and Abu Nu'aym for that matter, I mean, the sort of in the mutaakhirin, in the sort of hadith tradition, their tradition, as far as I understand, is, if you've done ihala, that's it, right? You've kind of referenced your isnad, and it's up to the experts to go and then read those texts and recognize that this is sort of, and sometimes they're doing, deliberately trying to find these obscure passages, because all the significant stuff, in a sense, has been codified at this point, and yeah.
But I mean, as we've seen in the previous episodes, and as will hopefully recur when we discuss Garrett Davidson's wonderful book, which we've been promising to discuss, inshallah, a future episode after Ramadan. Post-classical critics weren't necessarily passing all of these isnads, most of the time at least, readers of these ones.
But at the same time, in a sense, the responsibility of whether one is sort of like being a faithful transmitter is only there to the previous generation, in a sense, if you're including the full sanad. You're not making a claim that this is true. You're not saying this is sort of the Prophet. So that would be just my dissenting kind of reading of Jack's book. But
in any case, this is a very
can
valuable...
I say one final point about Abu Nu'aym is, even someone like Ibn Taymiyyah likes him. As far as I recall, he says that he actually does include a lot of sound reports. So and that's my recollection. I'm going to have to look at that. It's a short fatwa, if I recall correctly. So,
yes, I do remember, and this might be my last observation before we end, because he's of course interested. Well, Tabaqa works are important when it comes to rewriting the history of Sufism. People like As-Sulami, on whom Safarok Chowdhury has a monograph, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, recently.
And I remember he has a tafsir as well. And the Dhahabi says of his tafsir, if I remember correctly, fihi qarmata. So it has this kind of esotericist. And you can find, even in classical Sufism, Ghazali's Jawahir al-Quran is full of this kind of, al-Hasan wal-Husayn, Lolo wal-Murjan means al-Hasan wal-Husayn, this kind of business.
Yeah. I mean, this is it's a tricky business, isn't it? Because, I mean, you have these competing tendencies, as we briefly discussed, with Uzaima and Anjum talking about Sufism without mysticism, and in a sense, without the Arfan traditions that come in. And that's a tension that, continues to this day in very sort of like striking ways. Although I think for much of the last 1,000 years, the success has been on the side of the Arfaniyun, so to speak. But inshallah, I mean, I look forward to discussing these. And I just wanted to we've had one, Muhammad Aidrus, who's I think I'm sort of blanking on where we've met. But I feel as though we've met at an academic setting. But he says, Jazakumullah khairan for an enlightening series. I'm just going to share this. It's a very kind comment, and we're very grateful to you. Jazakumullah khair for a very enlightening series. Wishing you Ramadan Kareem and Sawm Maqbool, and looking forward to you again after Ramadan, inshallah. And that's a really wonderful point on which to end. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allahumma ballighna Ramadan. We're only, a matter of days away at this point. And I also wanted to sort of highlight that this is actually quite the opposite text in preparation for Ramadan, because it reminds.
So go away and read chapters 2 to 5 of Melchert's book, so that you're in the right spiritual state to commence your fasting.
And if Christopher, you're watching, I hope you take this in the sort of the humorous spirit that I'm sure you will take it in. And for those who are going to be observing Ramadan, inshallah, may Allah give us barakah in this month to really. Take the time to devote ourselves, and we are in mandatory uzla for most of it in any case. Barakallahu feekum. Jazakumullah khairan, Omar. I'm really grateful for your time. And
thank you, and also thank you to Dr. Melchert for this wonderful book. And I can introduce our next post-Ramadan book.
Yes, you like, please do. Please do, absolutely.
So we'd hope to cover this next week, but again, this is our last episode prior to Ramadan. But after Ramadan, inshallah, we shall be looking at Mustafa Bannister's fascinating study, The Abbasid Caliphate of Cairo, 1261 to 1517. So I'm sure you'll agree with me that this is a very exciting.
The subtitle, I think, is quite apposite, right? I mean, out of the shadows.
Yes.
Just the way in which the shadow caliphate is been dismissed in past scholarship, I think this will be a refreshing sort of new take on
Indeed,
on this
building,
question.
I imagine, on the work of Mona Hassan and
Absolutely,
others.
absolutely. Right.
Yes.
Jazakumullah khairan again, and thank you everyone for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you, inshallah, in around 5 weeks' time, I suppose. Or 5 or 6 weeks' time.
ومنكم صالح الأعمال والأقوال والأفعال. آمين.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.